first of all, I want to thank all of you so much for being here. I am so excited about this, and want to just spend a couple of minutes before we dive into our topic today and our amazing speakers. We're going to focus on the impact of food and brain health. I want to just tell you for a few minutes about the new organization that we have started. The organization is called Social Impact Partners. And a number of us in the industry really felt, as I talked with leaders in the nonprofit and for-profit space, we really felt that there were a few things missing. One of which is collaboration. If I have one of my superpowers has been able to try to bring people together and be a bridge. And so often you find people passionately working in the same space, but not talking to each other necessarily. And so one of the first things we wanted to do as we focus on combating Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative conditions, we really wanted to focus on collaboration, bringing more awareness to the problem. It is still the disease that is under the covers and not talked about. And we certainly believe that it is underfunded and there's not enough innovation and a younger generation involved. So as a result, we've started Social Impact Partners. There's lots of ways to get involved. The speaker series is going to be monthly and focus on brain health, what we know and what we can do about it. But this group is passionately involved in a number of areas, from engaging a younger generation in the battle. We have an enormously exciting youth board we have established. Many of them are going to be on the call today. Many of them are also in classes with a midday session. We have global leaders, as our speakers are, from all over the world, who focus on the impact of health and aging. And so if you want to join our consortium and are not part of it, please let us know. But I wanted today just to spend a minute, not that this group needs to be reminded the scope of the problem, but sometimes I think it is sobering just to remind ourselves of the numbers and what we are facing. We really believe that Alzheimer's is probably the most significant health crisis of this generation. It is absolutely a pandemic, and it affects so many of us. I think almost everyone on this call knows how personally it has affected our family, but you can't open your mouth without understanding how it has affected every family. And the numbers are staggering and growing. So just to put a number on it, currently today, 55 million people worldwide are diagnosed. Now, there are far more who are not diagnosed. And that number escalates when you think about this is a disease that affects the whole family, the caregivers, all of the family members. The aging of the population means that in the next 20 years, this number will double. We will have over 100 million. And just to kind of put a little bit of a sobering statistic on it, that means somebody contracts the disease every 3 seconds. So, and when we say contracts, they're diagnosed. We know that Alzheimer's, and part of what we're going to talk about today, is happening over a very long time. Brain health, how we live, how we age, what we do to our bodies really, really matters. So I also want to say that while this is the only major killer for which there is no known cure, there are many of us on this call and in this consortium who are working passionately on this. I think this is one of the most hopeful moments we have had in history in the last century in terms of what is happening with the science, what is happening with the momentum, and we really are committed to solving this horrific, horrific disease. So with all that being said, I want to put one other number out there, which you're going to learn a lot more about today. There is a whole body of science called epigenetics. And okay, that's a fancy word, but the epigenetics is basically what we do. It's our behavior. It's how our behavior impacts our health. And so a very hopeful number, as I have put out these other scary numbers, is that from all the research, our genes only make up about 20 or 30% of what's going to happen to us. The other 70 to 80%, and everybody differs a little bit on the 70 to 80, but the preponderance of what happens to us is actually what we do and how we live and how we go about this. So the super good news, and part of what we are intent on sharing, I wake up every morning thinking, I wish other people knew all that I know and that my friends know, but we really can do a lot about it. And so one of the most important things we can do is pay attention to what we eat. None of this is a perfect science. You are going to hear from truly two of the globe's most experts who affect the most number of people, and they have a lot to share with us. So let me talk for a second, introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to have them take it away. We are so thrilled to have both Sodexo at the table. For those of you who don't know Sodexo and our speakers today, we have a number of Sodexo members on this call, but our speakers today are Zeta Smith, who runs all of the U.S. Seniors division for Sodexo, and Mindi Manuel, who is just a luminary in this area, dietitian, nutritionist, who has really focused with Sodexo on a mind, diet, and significant global research. But to give you guys an idea of the impact this company has, Sodexo is one of the world's largest food companies and quality of life companies, and they serve over 100 million customers in 53 countries every day. They have over 500,000 employees. So when you think about somebody who could actually wake up in the morning and do something really, really, really significant about this, this is the group, and they're really passionate about it. Also at the table, we are so lucky to have the Blue Zones. I hope everybody on this call knows what the Blue Zones are, but if you don't, you're going to be buying lots of books and reading lots of things afterwards, because Blue Zones is really the most well-known and significant global research on the places in the world where people live the longest, and what do they have in common, and what is happening, and what do they eat, and how do they live. Today, we're going to focus more on the food piece of it, but we are so lucky to have Dexter Shurney, who is the president of Blue Zones Wellbeing Institute, and Michael Acker, who's really responsible for the Blue Zones community and urban services and getting this program out there. So with no further ado, I want to turn it over to Zeta and Mindi, who have a lot to share on what Sodexo is doing in this area. And they're going to be sharing their screen, so hopefully everybody can see it. I'll let you take it away, Zeta.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. And really, really excited to be here. Sarah, thank you for the invite. And obviously, this is a very important topic. Sarah shared a little bit about Sodexo. In particular, for me, I lead the seniors part of the business. And so we service hundreds of senior living communities with our dining. And so it really leads into a discussion around nutrition and diet, and quite frankly, a very, very important topic. So you'll hear from really the majority of the time from Mindi, who is obviously a registered dietitian, but she actually covers a region, a big portion of the country, and supporting on the clinical end. And she'll share a bit more in a minute. Why are we here? I think Sarah really set the stage for really the importance of this really concerning trend. And although she mentioned 55 million are diagnosed, our focus in my area is around senior living, and 6.5 million Americans 65 and older currently have Alzheimer's. What is most concerning, I think, to Sarah's point, is the trend is going to double in a little over 25 years from now. We will have 13 million of the 65 and older. So there's clearly an opportunity to address this. What's notable to the right is heart disease deaths have decreased 7.3%, but look at the significant exponential increase in the number of Alzheimer's disease deaths over just the last 10 years. And so the question is, what can we be doing now to try to curtail this trend? And for us, it is about food, it is about the dining service, and it's about nutrition. So I'm going to turn it over to the expert, which is Mindi Manuel, who is our registered dietitian supporting Sodexo for Seniors. So Mindi, I'll hand it to you to take over.
Thank you, Zeta. So again, I'm Mindi Manuel, a senior area clinical support manager for Sodexo Seniors, registered dietitian, certified specialist in gerontological nutrition, and a certified dementia practitioner. And I'm very professionally and personally passionate about this topic. So we want to talk about nutrition and diet and how it relates to cognitive health. And I think in order to set the stage and kind of ask why is that important, we need to talk about what the risk factors are for dementia. So first of all, there are 3 that are non-modifiable. There's 3 risk factors we can't do anything about. The first one being our age. Now, try as we all might to turn back that clock, we cannot do that. So age in and of itself is a risk factor for developing dementia. And then the other 2 are your genetics and your family history. Those are things you can't change. However, they have identified 12 risk factors that are modifiable. So they've shown that nearly 40% of worldwide dementias can be attributable to these 12 modifiable risk factors. And they found that with Alzheimer's disease, the changes in your brain happen up to 20 years before there's even an onset of symptoms. And that kind of shows why it's been so difficult to prevent and to treat, because these changes are happening so much earlier than when someone gets diagnosed. But that's also good news, because that's a considerable window of time that we have to intervene and really have a public health impact. Research has said that if we can have interventions that may delay the onset by just 5 years, we could have the cases of Alzheimer's disease and dementia in the next 50 years. So huge public health impact if we can do something about these modifiable risk factors. On the left in the blue, I've kind of put them into subcategories. So on the left are the modifiable risk factors that are related to diet and nutrition. And those are excess alcohol consumption, high blood pressure or hypertension, obesity, which is another big issue with, at least in our country, and then type 2 diabetes. And that is another very significant risk factor that those that have type 2 diabetes have 45 to 90% increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, which I think is huge. In the middle, I just want to mention the pink section are some risk factors that I think us as senior living operators and those of us in this industry could have an impact on. So social isolation and depression, making sure our residents are engaged and we have social activities for them, and then also identifying and treating any depressive symptoms in our residents. Hearing impairment, there's a lot of studies being done on how hearing impairment can really impact the development and progression of dementia. So making sure that we are checking our residents' hearing and providing any kind of adaptive aids they may need so that they can hear as best as they can. Smoking, I think most senior living operations have implemented non-smoking policies, which is great. And then finally, physical inactivity and, making sure that we can provide activity and keep our residents moving as long as possible. And then on the right is just a couple other risk factors that are modifiable. Level of education. So the more educated you are, the lower your risk, the less educated, the higher your risk. Exposure to air pollutants, so smog, chemical irritants, things like that. And finally, head injury. So if you have a history of a head injury, you have an increased risk of developing dementia. So what we wanted to kind of talk about today was there's been a lot of different diets studied for their impact on cognition, but we're today just going to focus on the MIND diet. And the MIND diet stands for the Mediterranean Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay. And this was a diet created by researchers at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. And they created it based on some components of the DASH diet and components of the Mediterranean diet that were specifically found to have cognitive benefits, and they included them in this diet. So the key components you can see here, that it's not a very specific prescriptive diet. It's more eating more of the foods they tell you to encourage and eating less of the foods that they tell you to limit. So it's taken components of the DASH and Mediterranean. So it's high in fruits and vegetables, but the MIND diet specifically calls out green leafy vegetables and berries. So they're very specific foods that have found to specifically impact cognition. So what did the study results show on this diet? It's actually pretty profound, I think. The study went from 2003 to 2013, and the initial results came out in 2015, and they found that those that followed the MIND diet most closely had a 53% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's as compared to those who followed it the least. That's huge. Also very profound is that those that just followed some components of this diet had a 35% lower risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. And then they also did a sub-study on it, and they were looking at those specifically on the green leafy vegetables. And they found that those that had the highest intake of green leafy vegetables had the equivalent of being 11 years younger in age. That really makes me want to eat a lot more green leafy vegetables, because if I could reverse 11 years, I'll take it. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to mention was a follow-up study done and was released in 2021. So it's a pretty recent one. Found that those that had the best adherence to the MIND diet had better cognitive functioning independent of brain pathology. So what that meant is that these researchers performed autopsies on the participants and basically studied their brains to look for those changes associated with dementia and Alzheimer's disease, the plaques and tangles. They were looking for evidence of the disease in their brains. And what they found was that those individuals that followed the MIND diet most closely had preserved cognition regardless of the evidence of the disease in their brain. So what that means, we're not too sure yet. We really need to have a little more studies on that, but we need to find out what it is about the diet that is preserving cognition despite having those changes in the brain. But it's very profound, and very interested to see how what they find out about how that mechanism is.
Yeah, I think, just listening to this and seeing these significant results, it begs the question, kind of what's the science behind the diet? Can you elaborate a little bit more there?
Sure. So they found very specific nutrients that provide protection to the brain, and then they've identified what those mechanisms of action are. So on the left here, you can see these are some of the nutrients that they found and how they're protecting the brain. So first, the MIND diet really has shown to have vascular protection. So if you remember, high blood pressure is one of the modifiable risk factors for dementia. And this diet has shown vascular protection through lowering the blood pressure as well as lowering our LDL cholesterol. And this is really done through the anti-inflammatory and antioxidant benefits of some of these nutrients like vitamin C, vitamin E, the flavonoids, carotenoids, and the non-flavonoid polyphenols. The B vitamins have shown neural protection, and this is through clearing homocysteine from your blood. So homocysteine actually is a compound that leads to the accumulation of the plaques and tangles in your brain. Also leads to neurotoxicity and cell death. So the B vitamins are clearing that homocysteine out of your blood, thereby having that neural protection. But also vitamin E, vitamin K, and flavonoids also provide neural protection. We've also found that B vitamins, vitamin K, and fiber help to improve the gut microbiota. There's a lot of studies being done on this now. There's what they're calling the gut-brain axis, and improving your gut microbiota is helping protect your brain through providing the anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects. And then vitamin E, vitamin K, folate, carotenoids, and omega-3 fatty acids all help to inhibit the deposition of those plaques and tangles that are associated with Alzheimer's disease. And then I just want to mention that, vascular protection is one of the key components, but also insulin sensitivity. I mentioned type 2 diabetes being one of those major risk factors. The MIND diet, as well as some other of the diets, help to improve insulin sensitivity. And it's important to kind of let everyone know that as you age, just generally speaking, as you age, you have 7 to 8% lower glucose uptake in your brain. So that is that insulin resistance. And then if you have type 2 diabetes, that's even more insulin resistance in your brain. And then Alzheimer's disease is even more insulin resistant in your brain, to the point that these studies are now touting Alzheimer's disease as type 3 diabetes, because in those individuals, the insulin resistance is so much higher than a normal aging adult. So the insulin sensitivity improvement with these diets is huge. And then lastly, I just want to say it's really the synergistic effect of all of these nutrients and all of these mechanisms that provide the biggest benefit.
Somebody for the,
Zeta, oh, sorry, Zeta, you had something you wanted to add?
no, I was just gonna ask a little bit more about, because these are for the layman.
Yep.
I was just gonna ask what foods we can find these in, but if you had a question, Sarah.
Well, I really actually was going along the same line, and also the impact of inflammation, which we know is so critical to the pathology and the biology of what's happening with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and many other diseases, and the breakdown of the cells. It really makes sense to me as I look at all the commonalities in the diets, that as we really focus on foods that also bring inflammation down or don't cause inflammation, are really, really important to what we're doing. I wonder if we might, because there's so much to talk about, and just so everyone on this Zoom knows, we're going to have 15 minutes at the end for save up all your questions to ask, and we're going to disseminate this information. But Mindi and Zeta, maybe what we do is turn it over to the blue zones, because there's going to be a lot of interesting overlap, commonality. It's really, this is kind of fun, all this research, because we can start making our own assessments. And then I'm going to ask all of you what you do in your own personal lives. I certainly have a regimen myself, but I'd love to turn it over, if it's okay, to our blue zone friends. And Michael, maybe you can start off by sharing with us a little bit more about the blue zones, and what they have in common, and the exciting part of the research. I've read every book, and also can't wait to hear from Dexter more about what's happening with the foundation and all the work that you're doing. So I'll let you guys take it away, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Sarah. Good morning, afternoon to everyone. Very pleased and privileged, honored and flattered to join you all today and to share our little corner of the world and the story of what we've been working on. I think you'll find a lot of commonalities in philosophy and approach with what you just saw from Sodexo. We didn't plan that, but I think a lot of the things point to some similar conclusions. So appreciate this opportunity. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Michael Acker. I lead the Blue Zones project effort. I've been with the organization for about 10 years, and I'm joined with my partner in crime, Dexter Shurney, who you'll hear from as well. Just a brief history lesson for those of you that don't know of or aren't familiar with the Blue Zones. The Blue Zones idea is based in a 20-year longevity study that was commissioned by National Geographic and a gentleman named Dan Buettner, who's a National Geographic author, explorer, and he founded this concept of the Blue Zones. The idea was, could we find the most extraordinary long-lived cultures across the world, understand what they were doing differently than everywhere else, and start to begin to almost, in a sense, reverse longevity in the principles that drove those extraordinary outcomes. And so Dan has done a bunch of work in not only identifying these places, also studying some of the happiest places across the world. And turns out there were 6 original Blue Zones, excuse me, 5. Places like Okinawa, Japan, and Sardinia, Italy, Icaria, Greece, Nicoya in Costa Rica, and even 1 American Blue Zones in Loma Linda. And if you're familiar with Loma Linda and the concentration of Seventh-day Adventists, the faith aspect of Blue Zones was really important. But these places were on average living to age 100 at almost 3 to 5 times the rates we see in the US. And on average, they were living 12 years longer, but not just 12 years longer, 12 years better. They tended to die quickly. They didn't spend the last stage of life hooked up to machines. And they were ultimately, in a lot of ways, achieving the outcomes that we're aspiring to achieve in the US. They had a fraction of the rate of chronic disease, heart disease, certain cancers. Dementia was almost non-existent. And so beyond identifying these places, we set out, as Sarah mentioned, to study, although we don't often use the term epigenetics, but what were they doing? What were these people doing differently? They had strong social networks. Here you see a group of Okinawan women that have been together for almost a century. The average age is 101 years old. They're put into these social networks and they're expected to travel through life together. In the blue zones, you'd find 80, 90, and 100-year-olds serving on the business councils, serving in community settings, living in multi-generational homes. Rick Grimes, who's on the call, who joined early, said he flunked at retirement. In the blue zones, they didn't have a word for retirement. Rather, words like ikigai that translate in English roughly to the reason why I get out of bed in the morning. So they had a strong sense of purpose. They had strong social networks. They got low intensity physical activity. Turns out the longest lived profession we found were shepherds and herders. They woke up late in the day, took a walk with the herd. By about 3 or 4, they were back at the local pub to drink wine with friends and family. So alcohol and wine was a staple of the blue zones in many cases, not all, but in many cases. So they were growing their own food in the gardens. They tended to eat very much a plant-based diet, very consistent with the Mayan diet that you just saw, Mediterranean combo of all those principles. They weren't vegans or vegetarians, but they tended to treat meat more like a celebratory food. They tended to have meat and fish about 4 times a month, no greater than the size of a deck of cards. And they had these time-honored rituals to reduce the caloric intake. They pre-plated their food in the kitchen. They would have these sayings at dinner like harahachi bu, which means let's stop when we're 80% full. They didn't eat like in Tennessee, where I'm from, off the compost pile in the middle of the table, seconds and thirds. They had these time-honored traditions and rituals. So we think the food was a really important cornerstone. But the biggest insight that we gleaned from all this work was not necessarily that the food independently was driving the outcomes. In fact, if you were to ask a blue zone centenarian or one of these 100-year-olds, how did you do it? They would look at you like a deer in the headlights. It happened to them. They didn't get on a diet. This was what was culturally acceptable. It was available. In fact, in the blue zones, they were largely poor. So they were eating a diet that consisted mostly of legumes, whole grains, vegetables. And it happened because they made it taste good. It was what was normal culturally, and it was available. And so these insights we took and said, most people know the right things to do and the things that they're not supposed to do, but how do we start to get at that 80% that Sarah talked about? If lifestyle makes up 80% of our outcomes, how do we really change behaviors? And the insight from the blue zones was that they didn't try to do it. There was no special magic bullet or pill or supplement. It happened as a byproduct of the way that they set up their cultures, their environments, and the communities in which they lived. And so we've created a program based off of this to say, how would we go into a community or an organization and engage people in these Power 9 principles, which you'll hear more from Dexter? How do we go into the places where we spend our time, like the restaurants and the grocers and the schools and the work sites, and really change the environment to make healthy choices the default? And then how do we work with entire cities to make our communities walkable, to address things like food insecurity and food deserts, and to really make those healthy choices abundant through policy and legislation? That's our approach. And you can imagine it. We've worked with 80 communities across the US, impacting over 5 million people. And imagine going into a Blue Zones community for all the parents and going through a Blue Zones checkout lane, and instead of the Doritos and Coca-Cola, your kids get to reach for bananas and apples. That's sort of unheard of where I live, but these are the kind of things that we do. Or imagine going into every school and the kids are learning how to grow their own food in the school garden. And beyond learning how to grow it, learning how to make delicious meals from it is particularly with an emphasis in underserved areas of the community, as we talked about that relationship between education and access to resources and the results from the team at Sodexo. So that's what we do.
I hope too, when you just brought up something that is quite important to me, and I know many of us on this call, and maybe when Dexter's speaking, but I think that health equity piece of what you just said, and so much of what happens in more impoverished areas, of the access to the kinds of food that are going to make us, brain healthy and live longer. We have equity issues and access issues as well. And I know that's part of what the foundation is also working on, but I don't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to just point that out because there's so much we need to focus on here with what you've told us.
Well, it's a really important piece, Sarah. Thank you for highlighting it. We call that life radius model. You often hear us refer to it as health equity by design. And what we found is that the key to achieving overall health improvement, overall well-being, which is inclusive, of course, of brain health, is that it takes a village and it's a collective impact strategy. And this is a representation of one of our projects in Southwest Florida. Most people think of Southwest Florida as Naples, which is one of the wealthiest areas in the country. And of course, Naples is a component of the work that we did, but imagine Immokalee and Collier County. This is a very underserved area. And we were able to partner with over 800 organizations. Yeah, so every community member, every leader, every civic organization, every church, every worksite, every school, from all aspects of the community and all parts of the community represented, all feet walking in the same direction. And when you can do that, you can make real change at scale and really begin to get at the most important and the hardest part of this whole thing, which is how do you translate all the evidence into action? That's for us what we're really focused on. And Dexter for us is taking our science and our evidence and our thinking to the next level and really focus on, so what do we do with all this and where can we go from here? And as the world starts to get, I think, more and more engaged in this idea of lifestyle medicine, how can we better position some of the work that we've done into that growing movement? And so I'd love to turn it over to you, Dexter, to talk a little bit about this crosswalk and some of the things you're focused on around how do we take this to the even bigger level.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael, and thanks to everyone and Sarah for having us. I'm the president for the Blue Zone Wellbeing Institute. And one of the things that we do is we really try to make this research very practical. As we roll this out into communities, excuse me, as we roll this out into communities, how do we make it practical and how do we make it so that, as Michael said, the people really don't even have to think about it. It just happens to them, so that they're not always trying to exercise willpower. The environment just allows them to live these healthy ways. I am a past president for the American College of Lifestyle Medicine. So these are physicians and other clinicians that actually practice lifestyle medicine. And what you're looking at is the crosswalk between the blue zones and lifestyle medicine. And what you can see is that they align pretty closely. And the only reason we really need lifestyle medicine is because most of us don't live in a blue zone. And so we're deprived, or we don't get some of these things that naturally occur in these blue zones. So we have to be more intentional about it through lifestyle medicine. And lifestyle medicine, it is a medical intervention, and it's there to not only prevent, but also to reverse disease. Because when you take away the insults, whether it's food or lack of activity or too much stress in your life, you can actually reverse some of these diseases that we're talking about. A couple of things that Sarah touched on and that had to do with epigenetics. I want to put a fine point on that because I think it's so important. If patients or individuals think that their destiny is defined by their genetic makeup, then it's really hard to get them to change their habits. They really won't have the motivation to change because they'll say it's a fait accompli that, my genes are my destiny. But what Sarah pointed out and what we're learning is that that's really not the case. And so, for example, you saw those women in Japan, all over 100 years old. They did a study of Asian immigrants to the United States back in the 1990s. And it was done with almost 4,000 Asians that immigrated to Hawaii. And what they found is that once they got to Hawaii, they had a 50% higher rate of Alzheimer's than their Japanese cohorts that remained in Japan. And so the lesson here is that these were all Japanese. They were all the same genetic makeup, what changed? Their environment changed. They came from Japan to the United States, and then that's what happened. We also have a study, the King's College study out of London, where we looked at identical twins over a 10-year period, and based on muscle mass in their legs, they also had a significantly different outcome in terms of Alzheimer's disease. And this is the same genetic makeup of these individuals. We also know from the Blue Zones data with Loma Linda, which is a large, very diverse Southern California ethnic makeup of individuals, that the minorities, as Michael sort of pointed out, within that population, there are no health disparities. The gaps have actually closed between the majority and the minority population. So I just wanted to put a fine point on that. That is really significant. The other thing is, I want to go back to lifestyle medicine just for a second. So lifestyle medicine is more than just the food, as you can see from this slide, but the food makes up a very important component. So one of the things we know about lifestyle and lifestyle medicine is that it works at the root cause of disease, which for most of these chronic diseases is inflammation. We've touched on that. And inflammation is playing out with most of these chronic diseases, but it plays out differently. So it may play out as Alzheimer's in your brain. It may play out as cardiovascular disease in your heart. It may play out as chronic kidney disease in your kidney. But what we're finding is that the common axis is inflammation. And research on this that I was doing at Vanderbilt and other places really show that what we're talking about here, the MIND diet, is actually an anti-inflammatory diet that actually tackles more than just one issue. And that's also very encouraging to know. The other thing I'll say, and I know we have
Dexter, before you move on from that, I want to put a fine point on this. We are going to have a whole session on inflammation because there is so much we can do about it. And it really is. And even in the science that we are working on right now in the BioV, the pharma that I'm with, is really all focused on this as the root of biology for most of these diseases. And there is so much food, lifestyle, other things we can do to affect that inflammation. So fine point, and we're going to have you come back and talk about that some more. I'm sorry, go ahead with finishing your work.
Well, what I was going to end with is that, today's conversation is primarily around food. And food, if you really think about it, makes up a large component. I mentioned exercise in terms of the twin study out of London and muscle mass. But if you think about it, food is so important, but it has to be delivered. And so I talk about it in terms of delivery and payload. So once the blood has to get to the end organ, in this case, the brain, and then once it gets there, it has to have something that's valuable for the brain to use. And that's where the food comes in, both of these, because we know there were studies done with Vogel in the early 90s that showed what a high-fat diet does to your blood flow. It actually decreases your blood flow by about 30%. And it takes about 6 hours for your vessels to recover and the blood flow to resume to what's normal. So if you think about eating a high-fat breakfast with a lot of, butter and sugar and bacon, fat, or whatever, that's going to decrease the blood flow to your brain. And then it takes about 6 hours to recover, and then you hit it again with a high-fat lunch, and then you hit it again 6 hours later with a high-fat dinner. You really never allow your body to recover the insult from these high-fat diets. And then so you're decreasing the flow, and then the payload, as Mindi mentioned, if it lacks vitamin B, if it lacks, the K and the D and some of these things, well, then once it gets there, if it's just junk food, then that's not going to be a benefit either. So it's really a combination of these things. But if you think about food, it really is central to the kinds of things that we're doing. The other thing I'll say is that berries, and we touched on that, and you see that as part of the MIND diet, is very important. But and they've done studies even on students, that if you give them more berries during the day, they actually perform better on their SATs. So if any of you have students out there that's trying to get it into college, load them up on some berries, they'll actually do better. But one thing that you'll also recognize about these studies is that recently we found that the benefit of the berries is actually diminished by dairy in the diet. And if you saw Mindi's chart, she had dairy on one side and berries on the other. And in some ways, the dairy actually negates the benefit of the berries. So give your kids lots of berries, but lay off some of the dairy, the ice cream, and some of that as well. But anyway, thank you for an opportunity to rant a little bit.
Oh, this is so
hopefully
fantastic. Well, you just started to answer, and this was really the question that Zeta was asking as we were finishing hers and Mindi's section. I'd love to hear from all four of you. I just think this is so fun, and I don't think eating in a healthy way is actually a burden. It actually becomes sort of a fun challenge. You actually feel a lot better when you do it, and it's something I've been really focused on. And I'd love to hear from each of you, maybe even starting with you, Mindi, and Dexter. You were just giving us some of your thoughts, but from all four of you, interested personally in what you're doing. You have a lot of information. You're a registered dietitian. You have all this research. How are you applying it? And maybe a little bit more, one of there's simple things we can all do, but sugar, just that wild impact of sugar and sugar in everything that we have, simple things that we can just eliminate if we really focus on it. So Mindi, maybe you can start, and Zeta and Michael and Dexter a little bit more. I'd love to hear what you guys are doing, and then open it up to everyone else for questions. So be thinking of your questions or put them into the chat for what you want to ask everybody.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Sarah. I actually want to just touch on another research study that was done that really connects with what you started out with this morning and what Dexter talked about, and that's how genetics and lifestyle are linked. I just want to briefly talk. They've identified this ApoE4 gene that increases your risk of developing Alzheimer's. You get 2 copies, one from your mom, one from your dad. The more copies you have, the higher your risk is of developing Alzheimer's disease. But they did a research study on those living in the Mediterranean region, and that also have that ethnic background. So they have the same background, and they both people have the ApoE4 gene, same copies, same ethnic background, but you have those that live in Europe in the Mediterranean region and those living in America. And the ones living in Europe had a significantly decreased risk of Alzheimer's disease, but the same genes, they all had that ApoE4, but if you lived in Europe, your incidence was much lower, and they're attributing that to lifestyle and how these diets, so really your diet and your lifestyle can mitigate the effects of your genes. Or, on the opposite end, if you have the horrible diet, it can exacerbate it. So I thought that really tied into what we were talking about there.
It really does. I think also portion size. This goes back to your, it was so fascinating. As I've read all the Blue Zone research, it makes so much sense to me. This eat until you're 80% full, put portions in. When you go to Europe or really anywhere else on the planet, they serve you like normal sized, like little amounts. It's really what your stomach can take. And you come to America and you're fed these plates that could feed an entire family for one person, and then you're supposed to finish it. And it's not just what we're eating, it's how much and when we're eating during the day. Zeta, tell me about kind of what what you're focused on personally.
Yeah, I will tell you, in 2018 I decided to make a lifestyle change, and to your point, Sarah, reduce sugar intake. I was the one that people would say, are you having coffee with your sugar? I just would pour it and ketchup and all of those things.
Just so everyone knows, Zeta used to be very senior at Starbucks. She was one of the people running Starbucks. So the coffee sugar example is a good one.
Plus, it was blasphemy that I was putting sugar into this pristine cup of coffee of Starbucks. But long story short, I made that change. I was eating mostly fish, no red meats and berries, and even how I have felt, let alone the weight loss. And so now it's about influencing others. My husband and I both decided to make that lifestyle change. But I think it's so important just to educate people that, what that trend looks like is not good, not just for dementia, but, I think to Dexter's point, for a lot of other diseases. So the earlier we can make those lifestyle changes, more positive impact we can have.
Dexter, I'd like to ask you too, a lot of the research that I read, which is all of it, also says that it's not just what we're eating, it's also when. Some of these concepts of the fasting, right? Or being able to eat earlier in the evening, putting good things in our body and not, filling up. Now, this is where Europe might not do as well because they have such late dinners, but putting all that food in your body before you're about to go to sleep, of having this time period where our bodies can digest and not be consuming anything, like, between 6 or 7 at night and wait 12 hours the next day. Tell me a little bit about not just what we eat, but what you know about the timing of when we eat, because I think that's a really interesting point too. And this 80% rule of knowing that if not putting our bodies in a situation where whatever we're eating, we are just stuffing ourselves.
Yeah, great questions. I'll start with the 80% rule, and part of it is that it takes your brain a little bit longer to catch up to where your stomach is. It's kind of like if you drink too much alcohol too fast, you don't realize that you're already drunk until it's too late. And so oftentimes if we're eating quickly and we're eating to when we think we're full, we're already too full. So that's part of what's happening there, is you have to allow your brain to catch up to your stomach. In terms of the timing that we eat, there's a lot of research that's coming out on this, intermittent fasting and things like that. But what we've known for some time is that the earlier in the day that you eat, the better. People say, well, I skipped breakfast and I'm not hungry. Well, when you were a baby, you were hungry. It's kind of a learned habit of not being hungry in the morning. And what we find is that people that tend to eat earlier in the day rev up their metabolism for the entire day and tend to eat less throughout the day. The other thing is that late meals affect your sleep. And there have been studies on that as well. And what happens also when you eat is that you increase your cortisol level. And cortisol is a stress hormone. And it also wakes you up. And so the fact that you eat early in the day, that's great, because you want to wake up and you're ready to engage the day. And so you want to have that in your system. But when you're getting ready to go to bed, you don't want to have cortisol running around in your system. It's going to affect your sleep. And of course, sleep deprivation is a stress factor. And we know stress also leads to chronic inflammation. So this sleep question is one I've been working on continuously with my kids. We are going to have a whole session on the science of sleep because it is so critical. There's so much to cover in this space. I am starting to see, gosh, I could do this conversation all day. I'm having so much fun and we're just getting started, but I'm starting to see some wonderful questions popping up. And I really do want to try to save this final 10 minutes for an interactive discussion. Anyone who has a question, please put it in the chat, but I'd love for you to ask it yourself. If you can't, because you're in a loud situation, I can ask it for you. And also, if everyone could try to turn their cameras on while we're in this. We don't care if you're in your workout clothes, what's happening. I know we have a couple of our youth board members who are about to head to sports or classes, but would love to. And we have many of our youth board members on today, as well as many of our global consortium members. So it's so exciting to see all of you. I'd like to start with Carrie Sklar, who has a question. Carrie, do you mind putting on your microphone and asking yourself, or I can ask it for you if you'd like, but we'd prefer to hear from you.
No, I can ask. It was about the question. I've heard this. It wasn't the first time I've heard it. But the fact that what you do 20 to 25 years prior is what could potentially lead to, or the negative things that you do could lead to Alzheimer's. And that was it's a little bit shocking, and I think could become a little bit discouraging for people who are older. But I was just wondering, I don't know that fact, and maybe it is, and I just didn't know, is well known to the younger people, and thought that, like on college campuses where people are either, experimenting with drugs or alcohol, or clearly college campuses don't really have the best nutrition in their cafeterias. Like, that should be a huge emphasis that I feel like it's a missing piece that could help.
Harry, I am so glad that you brought that up, because part of what we are trying to do with social impact partners is, and this whole session is, let people know that really what they do today, in fact, what they do in their 20s and 30s and for their whole life. Like if I knew right now, if I knew then what I knew now, what I would have done differently, there's quite a few things. And I think the gift is for this younger generation, many of whom are on this call, many of whom are empowered in this whole movement, to say, okay, my sleep, my food, my exercise, my stress level, all of these things matter, because what we 100% know about this disease is it starts 20 or 30 years before we see the symptoms. And what we have learned from this incredible panel, and I'd like to have Dexter, Mindi, Zeta, Michael take it away, is that I hope the hopefulness of the fact that 80% of our end outcome, no matter what our genes are, is what we are doing, and being smart about this and being informed and sharing it with others and creating environments on our college campuses and in our homes that really support this. So I want to let our panel take it away. Mindi, I'm sure you've got some good thoughts on that, as does everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about the fact that they can kind of project, if we could have these lifestyle interventions that might prevent delay the onset or prevent these dementias, can have the cases of Alzheimer's disease and dementia in the next 50 years, is such a huge public health impact in the senior industry, as well as ourselves and our families and our children. I mean, it's such a huge impact. The sooner that you adopt these lifestyle changes, the greater the impact you're going to have on your future. So it really is the earlier we can get these lifestyle changes in place is going to be the best impact.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be too overly concerned with this. We know that our cells are always dying and then regenerating new cells. And if you are regenerating your new cells in a new environment, then the epigenetic expression of those cells will be healthier. We know, for example, hemoglobin A1C, the reason we check it every 3 months is because every 3 months our red blood cells die, and the new red blood cells are not and don't have the same glycogen content as the old cells, right? Because they came along in a new environment. And so that's happening with all of the cells, even our brain cells to some extent. And so to Mindi's point, if you can start making these changes, it can have long-lasting effects. And there's a study going on right now where they're looking at chronic kidney disease, and they're finding that even people that have a stage 4 and stage 3 can actually prolong going on dialysis by a number of years by changing their lifestyle. And we used to think that, my goodness, they're too far gone. How can that be? But we're finding that this is happening in other areas of the body as well.
We have an author on in our midst, Kathy Perry, who is a former wellness coach. And Kathy, I know you've got a question for the group. Do you mind asking it?
I will. Thank you. First, I want to say thank you. This is fun. This is in my space, and I actually was honored to have lunch with Dan Buettner about 15 years ago, as he came and spoke to a group that I was part of. So love his work. I've followed it forever. And so, yeah, I've done a lot of coaching. My story is, first of all, I think we learn through stories, and in that senior living space, so important to hear those stories of success. But my story is that my youngest daughter was diagnosed with a mitochondrial dysfunction over 20 years ago. I was already kind of living the healthy lifestyle, but then I dove in. And for those of you who don't know, mitochondrial dysfunction is the disease of no energy, because her cells didn't metabolize food into energy. So it took me down a long path, and she was given a 2-year life expectancy, and she lived 20 years. And in that 20 years, she was never hospitalized. So that's kind of my success story on food. But when I coached and I stepped away from that, and now I really serve in that senior living space, and powering up those organizations and teams and caregiving, because got a heart there. But people cannot step beyond that health is weight. And I try, and every time I come up, I was just with someone this weekend, and she's like, well, I can exercise that away. And I was like, actually, you can't, because even though you just ate that junk, you're not going to exercise it away. So what would you think, and where do you see that going, is how we do that paradigm shift, that weight doesn't equal health. I'm not saying that right, but you know what I mean, that weight is not the same as a healthy lifestyle. I've seen sugar addicts who are thin as beans. So yeah, that's my question.
You have type 2 diabetics that are thin as beans as well. One of the things I'll tell you is that if you really are eating the fiber that Mindi was talking about, if you're getting 40 and 50 grams of fiber, you're going to lose weight because there's no room for all that other high calorie stuff. Get your fiber, and there's really no room for some of that junk food. And the weight starts to come down. You know, we had a little bit of a conversation about plant-based diets, and Michael brought out the point that not all of the Blue Zones folks are vegan or vegetarian, but it is 95% plant-based. But we talk about whole foods plant-based, and there are two parts of that. It's not just being plant-based, it's really being whole foods. And that's where you get all the fiber in your diet and all these antioxidants and nutrients that we've been talking about. It used to be, we would say if you go vegetarian or plant-based, then you're going to get healthy because there weren't all of these alternative things to go to. Now there's a lot of junk vegan food, and you can be totally plant-based and be totally unhealthy. So yeah. I want to just stress the fact that we have to look at this whole food process. And also when you think about the gut microbiome, if we change the gut microbiome, we know we change people's weight parameters as well, because when they do fecal transplants, you can take the gut microbiome from a fat person and they become thin, and vice versa. A thin person now becomes overweight by just changing that up. And we know that a lot of that is due to the fiber in the food and the quality of the food that we're eating, getting away from ultra processed foods and things like that.
Dexter, that is such an important piece of this, and just trying to take away, looking at the organic, looking at getting some of those preservatives out of what we eat. But that brings back up the equity and the cost question. I am already looking at our time. This should have been a 4-hour conversation. I know how busy everyone is. If we may just run over by a few minutes, because there's one other really critical question I hope we can spend a second answering. And so if we can borrow 5 minutes of your time, we will understand if you do have to go. But Elizabeth Thompson is here from the food bank. And Elizabeth, I'd really like you to ask your question, because I think it's one of the things, and health equity is something I want to focus on in one of our sessions. I know something that's passionate to everyone on this call, but maybe you could just quickly ask your question and we'll see if we can get an answer from the panel.
It's a little bit more of a speech than a question, but that's
okay. It's an important one.
If everyone can please keep in mind, the Greater Boston Food Bank serves about 600,000 people each month in Eastern Massachusetts. And we have done a great job of getting more produce to the community. We're up to about a third of what we're distributing as fresh produce. So 30 million pounds last year. But inflation is taking a huge toll in the community. And so people are, selecting away, right, from produce to less healthy choices. So if you guys can just please remember that it's going on out there. And as much as the prices at the grocery store hurt us, it's really taking a toll in the community. So it's my speech. Thanks.
Is there anything you'd like to comment on that particular question?
We didn't hear who you were addressing, Sarah.
Oh, I just, I think one of the things that we've all talked about, and it really does need to be for a future conversation, is as we look at what's happening in areas of poverty, and particularly the prevalence or the increased numbers of Alzheimer's, dementia, and all diseases where people do not have access to what we are talking about, and even the opportunity to do an 80% plant-based or even close to. So that needs to be a topic for another day. I am so enormously grateful. I see some of my best friends, my compatriots, my kind of lifelong colleagues in this battle, my family, my daughter, my son, my mother, and lots of mother-daughter pairs on this call today. I hope that everybody will get involved with what we're doing with Social Impact Partners. It is a place that we can come together and collaborate and share and work on things together, from the private sector, the public sector, the government, the younger generation, all of us. We really need to dive in and do this together. And so I encourage you to look on our website, socialimpact.partners, And if you are not part of our consortium, we would love to have you be. We have both a youth leader board as well as other global leaders in health. And we are doing two very exciting things on top of the speaker series and the other initiatives, as we have a global Olympics that we are running with youth teams from all over the world who are going to be working with some of the major corporations to figure out how we can focus on brain health and healthy aging. Sodexo is one of the ones who has signed up to do this. So really exciting opportunity to look at how our young people can help inform ways that we can even better orient our companies and our products toward servicing brain health. Also, we have a business plan contest, again, focused right now on 35 and under to qualify. And so look on our website too. And if you need help in putting business plans together, we can help you. There's a lot of mentorship in this group. But I think one of the things that's hopefully coming out of this is that we all need to get into this together. We really do need to draw off of our younger generation to help us, and that we really can find a solution to this disease. And while we are working on that, there is so much we can do every day, which we will be highlighting in this brain health series every month, about how we can affect that 80%, which is how we live and what we do. So thank you all so much for coming and being together with me in this fight.